Chapter 3, Snow. Summary. How afraid were you, Sansa? Back in a city of liars and thieves, with no shield between you and the Lannisters but their contempt. Oh, sweet, darling sister, how afraid were you? How brave were you? They met Jon in the dungeons. He inhaled sharply at the bruise on her face. Taking her chin into his hand, he inspected it closely, angling her face for the light. Sansa bore it as patiently as she could. "I'm sorry," he said, quiet enough that she could barely hear. "What for?" Sansa asked tartly. She couldn't stop thinking of Island Pain and the way his neck had given under the pressure of her sword. If she did, she would scream. If she did, she would not have the strength to leave. So she shoved it down and aside and kept her tone flippant. "A bruise is little enough to pay for freedom. And you have ice, don't you?" "I took some searching, but I found it." "Good. Then we have to leave, don't we?" Jon still looked hesitant, but at the mulish turn to her jaw and steely eyes, he let it go and started leading them into the dungeons. They snuck out and emerged into a small moonlit clearing, a horse tied to a low-lying branch grazing contentedly on the grass. One horse. "Where's the other?" she asked, and though she knew it to be a stupid question, couldn't help but hope that there was another hidden in the brush, wandered away by accident. Jon looked sheepish. "There isn't another. No horse can carry 3 people at once," she said slowly. "Well, what were you thinking, Jon? We have to move fast. We can't do that with a horse loaded down with 3 bodies." Her hands began to shake slightly. "Oh gods, I killed Island Pain. We're going to be caught. I'm going to die." "Nobody's dying," Jon said sharply before Father could speak. "The horse can carry 2 people." "And the third?" He hesitated. After a moment, he gestured to Ghost, who had crept out of the underbrush and now stood beside him, reaching Jon's shoulder, and easily as broad as the horse, it was clear what he wanted. Sansa blanched. "Jon." "You can ride Ghost," he said, eyes pitifully wide. "Please, Sansa? His stride's a bit too rough for Father to take on his leg, and I'm a better horse rider than either of you." No one, Sansa thought spitefully, should be able to pull eyes so large. It's unnatural, is what it is. "Fine," she snapped, and let exasperation paper over her fear. "But you owe me, Jon Snow. You don't even have a saddle." "That difficult, is it?" Sansa tossed her head. "I can handle it, I'm sure. But the only reason for me to do so is because of your lack of planning, which is," she sneered, "unconscionable." "Oh, I'm sorry," he grumbled back, tightening the saddle on the horse and readying to ride. "Should I have just broken into the stables and stolen a Lannister horse? That would definitely have been quiet." "It would have made life much easier," Sansa replied, and then, after a moment's contemplation, managed to drag herself atop Ghost. Jon rolled his eyes. He laced his fingers together to form a step for their father, and after both of them were mounted, he said, "I'm here to protect you, Sansa, not serve you." She exhaled irritably, but before she could answer, Jon dug his heels into the horse's sides and they were off. They didn't stop for another full day. It was past midnight by the time Sansa saw Father swaying in his seat behind Jon. After a few minutes, she hissed Jon's name and signaled a halt. Jon had been leading them through backroads. People would remember a lone girl and 2 men, not to mention the white direwolf accompanying them. The King's Road might have been quicker, but safety was of more importance. That night, Sansa fixed up Ned's leg again. "Rosemary oil again?" he asked wearily, legs stretched out in front of him, back leaning against a tree trunk. Sansa snorted. "I didn't pack the rosemary oil. It doesn't actually do anything." "You slathered my leg in it," he said flatly. "It smells good," she replied quietly, feeling her lips twitch. And I didn't want to be in the Red Keep much, and the only person who I trusted was you, and it gave me an excuse to come sit with you." He frowned heavily. "You didn't trust the Lannisters?" "No." "Why?" It was an honest question, Sansa thought. Her father was curious. And it made sense. He thought she liked the dances and gaiety of the Southern court. For her to be so wary of Joffrey and the other Lannisters didn't make sense. I'll tell you all about it," she said finally. "I told you it was a long story, and it is. But Jon should be here for it. He plays a big part in it, too." "Of course," said Father, and Sansa managed to tack up her lips into a smile. She finished unwrapping the bandages and then stepped away, wrapping an arm around herself and staring into the small, crackling fire in the middle of the clearing. By the time Jon returned, Ned felt a familiar bone-deep exhaustion. Familiar because he remembered Robert's rebellion, and then the Greyjoy one after, the cold earth, the damp cloth, the stink of horses and humans. The tiredness that crept into one's bones and stayed there until one could scarcely remember living without it. "Ghost managed to hunt some rabbits," Jon said, returning to their makeshift camp. "Took his own sweet time doing it, too." Sansa rolled her eyes. "I'm sure you were a paragon of focus as well." "What is that supposed to mean?" Jon asked, sounding injured. She took the rabbits from him along with a knife and began to skin them with remarkable skill. "There's a red stain along your chin. Your sword is still in its scabbard, and you've either gotten a very lumpy chest or you hid something there." She looked up and arched an unimpressed eyebrow. "Did you find some berries, or are you planning on keeping them as a surprise?" "I wanted to give them later," he said, taking out a bag from under his jerkin and tossing it to her. When he stomped across the fire to sit at the opposite end, Sansa seemed to soften. "Don't sulk," she told him. "I was just teasing. And they'll make a nice breakfast tomorrow as well." Jon sighed, but after a moment, he took out another knife and started skinning another rabbit. Both of them looked startlingly used to this banter. Ned wanted to ask when this had happened, this easy camaraderie, this give and take of information. He thought their relationship was fraught with Ned's secrets and lies. He thought that she'd accepted him as a sworn shield for lack of other options. He hadn't expected this long familiar warmth. "Sansa?" he asked, instead of commenting on it. His daughter's shoulders drew tight for a heartbeat. When she turned to fully face him, however, there was nothing of discomfort in her features. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I should tell you now." "I suppose you should," Ned replied, trying not to show impatience. She already looked spooked as it was. "Well," Sansa began, shooting an unreadable look through the fire at Jon, "do you remember that night, Father? When I burst into your rooms?" "The night you told Robb." Ned frowned, reaching for the words. After a moment, he found them. "That he'd be king?" "Yes." I don't think I'll ever forget it. You gave me and your mother quite a fright, and then didn't tell us why you were so distraught." She looked slightly guilty over that, but when she spoke, her voice held none of it. "Well, I had a dream that night. It was very realistic." "A dream of what?" "The future," she said softly. Ned blinked. "The future? What in the hells?" "If you don't wish to tell me," he said sharply, "there's no need to make up fantastic stories." Jon suddenly shifted, purposely drawing attention to himself. Sansa remained still, poised and frozen, but Ned turned to him. "She's not lying," Jon said. "Do you remember us asking who the brother of the Prince of Dorne was? His name? Sansa's the one who told us." "Oberyn," Sansa murmured, blue eyes focused uncannily on Ned's. "That's his name." Ned didn't respond to that. He glanced at Jon and asked, flatly, "Us?" Jon, whose hands hadn't stopped skinning the rabbit, froze. The look he shot at Sansa was apologetic, Ned thought, apologetic, and the same expression he got when he had done some mischief and had to take his lumps, a mixture of resignation, unhappiness, and resolve. "Rob and I," he offered as an explanation. It was all that was needed. "The three of you." Ned began disbelievingly, only to cut himself off and start over again. "The three of you lied to me, to Caitlin, to your brothers and sisters for years." "Would you have believed me?" Sansa asked, and there was iron underneath her sadness. "You'd have had Maester Luwin drug me with milk of poppy, and when I woke up, attempt to convince me I saw nothing. That's the future." "Dreams don't tell the future." "That wasn't a dream," she hissed, and Ned recoiled. They fell silent, all of them. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and rustle of leaves around them. "That wasn't a dream," Sansa repeated, this time weary. "It's never been a dream, Father. It's the truth. It's a hard and terrible truth. It's what will happen if we don't act. We are the Starks of Winterfell. You know what they say of us." Her lips twitched into a wan smile. "Blood doesn't run in our veins. 'Tis honor and duty and love. I did what I had to do so we could survive. I'm not sorry for it." "Then tell me what happens that is so terrifying to you," Ned challenged. Jon suddenly moved his hands, catching onto Sansa's shoulders as he knelt beside her and whispered something into her hair. Had they not been in such a quiet area, Ned might not have heard, but forests tended to swallow ambient noise. He heard everything. "Don't say anything too painful. You've already said more than you have to me or Rob in years. Take it easy, don't push yourself too much." What horrible things had Sansa faced that she didn't speak of them? That she had to control herself so much? That she didn't tell her brothers for years? Through the slowly dawning horror, he saw Sansa lift her chin proudly and turn to him. "They killed you," she told him, and though her voice remained calm, her eyes were averted. "I was betrothed to Joffrey before we left Winterfell. When they arrested you, I begged Joffrey to pardon you. He promised to do so. And then he had Island Pain take your head, just to see me scream. Gods above." Ned's fingers dug into the meat of his thigh, likely bruising it. He could see what she had said so easily, the sun hanging low in the sky, the painful hope of escape by confessing, the grief and loss that came when it was all ripped away. What was a single bruise compared to seeing your own father dead in front of you? Of seeing his beheading? Ned had imagined the death of his father for years, the stink of burning flesh, the way Brandon's face must have twisted, but he'd never had reality to augment it. He was so glad he did not. "Sansa," he said and opened his arms. She hadn't wept when she told him, but when she flung herself at him, he could feel the aborted sobs running through her chest. "Sansa, sweetling, don't you worry, I'm here. You brought us out." I know, she was saying through her own tears. "I was so afraid. Cersei wanted to have the trial with Robb, and when he didn't respond, she looked so angry." "Shoo, hush. It hasn't come to pass. It won't come to pass. I'm right here. I'm sorry, Sansa, darling, I didn't see you and didn't think." Sansa buried her head against his chest, curling against him like slowly unfurling petals. Ned felt a fullness in his chest along with the disbelief, along with the grief. But they were alive, and they were free. Ned could scarcely believe his daughter's stories, but he could also scarcely disbelieve her. Sansa had never been prone to thinking impossible things, for all that he might have believed that of her when she was a child. She had changed after that terrible night. His Sansa had grown, and he couldn't see any lies in her story now. They were alive and they were free. Oh, he'd have questions later, definitely, but he'd take his blessings here, right now, where he found them, and wouldn't look too closely at it. Sansa began to cut layers off her skirts. It was still summer, and the south was warm enough that she didn't need the cloth to keep from feeling chilled. She took a needle and thread from the medicine kit she'd packed for her father, and began to stitch a pair of breeches for herself. If she were to ride Ghost all the way back to Winterfell, it'd make far more sense for her to be able to actually grip his sides rather than hold on and pray that she didn't fall off. Father arched an eyebrow when she emerged one morning with her skirts cut and breeches clearly visible underneath. Jon only laughed at her and told her that if she wasn't careful, she'd become Arya. "Fat chance," she retorted. "I'm burning everything from King's Landing the night we get to Winterfell." Get to Winterfell a month ago, and she wouldn't have been so careless. But the air was growing colder. Slowly but surely, the earth was becoming mulchy under their feet. The trees were growing taller and wider. Winterfell didn't seem so far now. Lannister men were on their heels, but they were falling further and further behind now that they were in the Riverlands proper. Some nights, Winterfell felt close enough to taste. Jon grinned now, less self-conscious and more relieved. Proximity to Winterfell was having a good influence on all of them. "You light the bonfire, but I'm going to burn that red cloak," he said, gesturing to the dirt-stained travesty their father kept wrapped up in a bundle underneath the saddle. Father shook his head. "If anyone's got a claim to that thing, it's me. You burn that damned awful jerkin, Jon. It looks horrible on you." "This one?" he asked, looking down at it. "It's fine." It had started as a shade of deep gold slashed with black. Weeks of riding and roughing it had managed to turn it the shade of vomit, with liberal blood and dirt interspersed throughout. "That," Sansa told him, "is such a lie you ought to be ashamed of yourself." It felt nice to see Father actually laughing and speaking. There had been a few days when she'd worried, because his face had been so gray and he'd looked so exhausted. His leg must have been bothering him more than she'd expected. But now he looked healthier, and a week ago, when she'd fallen asleep holding onto Ghost and promptly been dumped into a stream, he'd laughed and laughed, hard enough that Jon had looked torn between which one to help, the water-soaked girl who still looked bleary, or the madman who'd gone purple. It was nice. A buoyancy that sank into her gut, getting lighter with every passing day. There are no words for this, thought Sansa. There are no words for this kind of love or for this kind of happiness. This is my strength. This is my weakness. These are my flaws, but this is what my spine is made of. Sansa awoke from a dream, eyes catching and holding Jon's. "Arya's home," she breathed, and he wanted to ask her how she knew, but there was such fevered joy in her eyes that all he could do was reach out and grip her hand tightly. "So will we," he said. "Soon, Sansa, soon." When they crested the neck, Sansa gathered the moss of blue-veined trees and began the tedious process of washing the dye from her hair. Father looked startled to think that she had purposely hidden herself in such a manner, but Jon only looked relieved that it would be back to normal. The morning she awoke with hair a familiar shade of sunset red, her father told her that he'd never before thought anyone else could have hair that color. "When I first met your mother, her hair was unbound," he told Sansa quietly. It was early morning, and Jon was still asleep. He was the one who worked the hardest, the longest. Neither of them begrudged him his rest. I'd never before seen hair that color. It was like someone had taken the weirwood leaves and woven them into hair. He sighed. Over the years, it's darkened, and Robb, Bran, and Rickon might have her coloring, but their hair's always been darker than Catelyn's ever was. I thought you'd go the same route for many years, too." "Rather noticeable," she commented, fingering the still damp strands. "I mean, I didn't want to be, in King's Landing. But I've had red hair far longer than I've ever had brown. It's nice to feel normal again." He nodded slowly, and they sank into a comfortable silence once more. Jon had a number of reasons for walking into the cave. There was a storm coming. They could feel the electric heaviness in the air even now, and so they had decided to hunker down in a nearby cave instead of trying to outrun it. Their horse had started limping, and so Father had been looking over him, Sansa had murmured something about her hair and readying the cave and gone there, while Jon had gone to fetch firewood. Usually, he took his time gathering the wood. Usually, he let the pressures and tensions of the day fade a little when he was alone for the firewood. As a result, he tended to take a little longer than necessary to do the job, even if it wasn't entirely noticeable to anyone else. But today there was a storm, and Jon was exhausted enough that all he wanted was to sleep. So he looked for dry wood quickly and headed back just as fast, looking forward to a quiet night. What he didn't expect was for Sansa to be stripped down to her shift, hair spilling over her shoulders as she washed up. Jon jumped and the firewood in his hands clattered to the floor, making Sansa whirl around and shriek loudly. He immediately averted his eyes and looked to the entrance. He stammered, and then managed to sidle out before things got any worse. He wasn't sure how it could get worse, but his cheeks were hot enough to light braziers already. He didn't want to imagine what could happen if it was even more embarrassing. By the time their father returned from tending to the horse, thankfully, it hadn't thrown a shoe, but only had a thorn in its hoof. He was standing outside the cave, feeling more like a sentry than any sworn shield. "Something happened?" he asked. Jon immediately flushed. "No," he said, and wished it didn't sound so strained. "But it might be better if we wait outside for a couple of minutes." Father sent him a quizzical look, but it seemed that he'd adopted a policy of not asking after the numerous changes to his children so long as he could pretend he wasn't seeing it. It was a relief for both of them. A few minutes later, Sansa called them to enter. She'd already lit a fire, and her face looked suspiciously pink in the firelight when she looked at him. In the dim light, Jon couldn't help but remember the way water damped her shift, making it cling to her hips. "She is your sister," he thought, and closed his eyes firmly. "Do you remember old man stories of wargs?" Sansa asked one night when she couldn't sleep and Jon remained awake. "Aye," he said, stirring the fire. "Men who can see through the eyes of animals. She sang some long story of Baal, the bard being one, didn't she?" Sansa swallowed hard. "Skin changers," she whispered. "It's said to be in the blood of the first men, and that is who we are." "Sansa." "I dream of Lady," she said clearly, calmly, showing nothing of her racing heart. "Not of Lady, not exactly. That I am Lady. I am her, and she is me, and there is nothing that can separate us." "But death." The whisper seemed to coil up the base of her skull like a fanged snake. Sansa wanted to shiver and ache, but all she did was stare into the glowing depths of the fire. "You think you're a warg?" "That I am? That we all are?" Jon looked startled. His dark eyes swallowed the light, and the deer planes of his face seemed hard and foreign in the darkness. "I thought they were just dreams," he said finally, after a long pause. "Oh, thank the gods," Sansa replied, feeling tears sting at the corners of her eyes. Relief at not being alone any longer. "So I'm not alone." He looked up, and there was a promise in his eyes that made heat uncurl in the hollows of her chest. "Never," he murmured, and if it made Sansa a fool to believe him, she thought she'd take the insult gladly. They were just past Moat Cailin when Ned heard the distinctive sound of hoofbeats. Jon immediately pulled their horse to the side and Sansa crouched low on Ghost's back. The direwolf snuck into the shadows, and in a matter of moments it was as if nobody had been there to begin with. They were all getting practice at this. But this time, they were past the neck. They were supposed to be safe. How could Lannister forces invade the north without starting a war? Ned looked upwards, peering through the darkness, only to identify the riders as markless. Mercenaries. Not Lannister men, not any lord's men, just men with steel in their fists and a desire for blood, willing to kill and fight for gold. He frowned and looked closer. There was something there, like a drum just slightly out of beat with 10 others, a dissonance only visible if one knew to look for it. There was something there, and Ned knew there was something there. He just didn't know what. The riders left after a few moments milling about, presumably to take the King's Road. That night, Ned didn't dream of Winterfell or Catelyn or his children. He didn't dream about King's Landing or Lyanna or Harrenhal. He didn't dream about Brandon or his father or even the 2 rebellions he had served in. No. Ned dreamt that he was back in the Vale, an awkward, stern, friendless boy sent to live under a man to whom honor was of paramount importance. In the dream, Robert was young and beardless, and his blue eyes gleamed like silver rust. Ned was in his room, sulking and terrified of stepping outside. He'd seen Robert enter the gates of the Eyrie that morning but hadn't gone down to see him. And then his door had burst open under the immense strain of Robert Baratheon, all his magnificent aura spent trying to make friends of Ned, and there had been no going back to his quiet, airy little life. Robert dragged him to a joust that Ned was definitely not interested in, and forced him to sit through hours of explanations and monologues on the inanities of horseflesh, and Ned finally started to ignore Robert in favor of the blue and gray armor, shod Vale men. "Some men aren't knights but wish to compete," Robert said in Ned's dream, voice suddenly calm and contemplative. "Those wear no armor, but you can see their reins, can't you, Ned? That's gonna be blue. Or gray. If we were back at Storm's End, they'd be black and yellow. They say the Targaryens used to dip their reins in blood to make them red." Blue reins, thought Ned, and awoke with a gasp. Those riders from that morning had reins a pale blue, as if frosted roses had fallen on the leather accidentally and stained it. What do Vale mercenaries wish to do in the north? There was a low-lying hill that extended straight out of the Wolfswood. From it, one could see the tips of Winterfell's turrets, and if it was a clear day, the fluttering banners as well. Jon felt his heart clench when he saw the pale flags pulling taut against the wind. "Winterfell," Sansa whispered. "Oh, Jon, look." "Here," said their father. "Yes," replied Jon. "Yes. Come on, we can reach by tonight if we hurry." None of them were in shape to stop riding after that. The sun was still high in the sky when they rode in, hooves thundering. Jon tried to pull up to declare who they were to the guards on the turrets, but Sansa wasn't having any of it. She ducked her head, murmured something into Ghost's ear, and then they were off like a shot, a blur of white fur and red hair. Jon cursed under his breath, echoed by their father's amused chuckle, and dug his heels into the horses' sides. They entered the courtyard a heartbeat after Sansa, only to find it frozen. Sansa stood in the middle, and among the cold gray stones, her hair, loose around her shoulders, stood out like a banner. One hand was pressed to her mouth, and the other was knotted in ghost fur, as if it was the only thing holding her up. Robb stood in the middle of the courtyard, just as still and stunned as everyone else. He looked broader, Jon thought distantly. Broader, stronger, steel in his jaw and a strength that hadn't been there when they'd left. He held a wooden sword in his hand that drooped as if he'd forgotten it. To move was to break a tableau, a dream, a hope. And then Sansa, brave Sansa, let go of Ghost, straightened, and began to move forward. It was all that was needed for Robb to lunge forwards, hands dropping the sword and coming up to cradle her. The choked cry that came from his lips hurt Jon's chest. Sansa dug her hands into his shoulders and stretched to whisper something in his ear. Robb gave a shuddering sigh, and some cold stiffness faded from his tense shoulders. A moment later, the men were shouting for Bran and Arya and Lady Catelyn. Everything dissolved then. Jon wasn't entirely sure when the others became aware of their presence, but he did remember some things clearly. Arya's arms tightening against his chest, Robb choking on words as they embraced, the staggering, lanky weight of Bran wrapping around him. When Lady Catelyn appeared at the door, she looked pale with shock. Upon seeing Sansa, she almost collapsed, barely catching herself against the stone wall. Sansa must have seen her mother through some unknown mechanism. She slipped past both Bran and Robb and hugged her on the front steps of the keep. That close, she looked almost as tall as her mother, No, taller. Then Lady Catelyn looked past Sansa's shoulder and saw her husband. Her face twisted, flicking through the emotions almost quicker than Jon could follow. Shock, then hope, finally settling on something almost too intimate for everyone's eyes. Before Jon could decide how to react, they were in each other's arms, kissing more tenderly than Jon could have imagined. It was all terribly embarrassing. Robb looked as if he agreed. His cheeks were a tad too red to be accounted for with excitement or exercise. While his parents looked lost in each other, he took charge with an ease that hadn't been there before. He ushered them inside and told the servants to leave their lord and lady alone for as long as necessary. Once that was over, Robb led them not to the Great Hall, as Jon had half thought he might. Instead, he took them to his chambers, and all those who could fit piled onto the bed. Sansa and Robb took the chairs. When the food arrived, not 5 minutes later, Jon felt he was almost back in his childhood, all of them awaiting one of Sansa's and Robb's reenactments of the old songs, eating their way through food despite knowing they'd be scolded for it in the morning, and above all, warm. Robb sighed. He spoke haltingly, and the way he picked at his food told Jon that he was more relieved than anything Robb could have said. He'd always had a habit of it, no matter how much his mother tried to stop him. "The Lannisters got angry," he said, "almost 4 months ago. The letters that you'd been writing stopped, and then 2 of them came, but they were from a maester's hands. I was worried, so worried, and then Arya came home and told us Jon returned to save Sansa, but nobody said a word. There." "The Lannisters didn't send anything official," Arya interrupted. For a heartbeat, she looked furious for all her Stark features. For just a heartbeat, she looked like her mother reborn. "But there were rumors, and last week, a woman came out of nowhere and tried to pretend to be Sansa." Sansa went cold and quiet, and very carefully placed her hands flat on her lap. She swallowed and then looked up, straight into Robb's eyes. "Tell me you chased her out of Winterfell," she said. "Didn't let her stay the night," Robb replied, a nasty light in his eyes. Jon waited and was rewarded with Robb's smirking finish. "Arya chased the Lannister wench out of Winterfell with Lady and Nymeria beside her. I don't think she'll stop running until she's well short of the neck." "Thank you," Sansa told Arya. Arya looked startled. It had probably been ages since Sansa had said something so meaningful to her sister. To stop their fights, Sansa had stopped talking to her as extensively as she once used to. To be faced with something so meant from Sansa must have been an entirely new experience for Arya. Hopefully Arya's grown up a little since I left her, Jon thought. But when Sansa turned to talk to Robb, Arya only frowned thoughtfully into her plate. A thinking Arya is a dangerous Arya. Robb sighed and gestured a little wildly. "There were other rumors too, you know. About a noble-born girl being taken by Vale soldiers, about another being caught in the Westerlands. You took your own sweet time getting here." "We had to keep it quiet," Sansa replied. Color was still high in her cheeks, and she looked startlingly beautiful with it. The candlelight shone off her unbound hair. She resembled the oldest statues in the crypts, Jon thought, all lovely skin and steady, unshaking features. "We couldn't take the King's Road, and the Lannisters probably don't want it to be known that a 14-year-old girl and her injured father can escape from King's Landing without anyone stopping them." "How is father's leg?" "Not so bad as expected." She shrugged. "It looked worse than it was when I got father out of the cells, and I spent more than a month making sure he got better. And nobody thought I could lie either, so they believed me when I cried about the pus." "Oh yes," drawled Arya. "Prissy little Sansa crying about the yellow stuff in father's leg. However, did you live?" Sansa faltered, for the first time that night. "We can't handle this tonight," Jon thought, and spoke before she could make Arya even more suspicious. "By being smart and keeping her head down," he said mildly, and then Robb rolled his eyes and Bran started chattering about a gargoyle on the 3rd floor, and the strange tension between Sansa and Arya snapped. All Jon could think was that he was warm, that the cold lump in his belly was gone, that his chest was tight and hot with something he didn't dare name. Sansa was happy. They were home. They were safe, and Jon had brought them here, and he had done his job. When he fell asleep at the table, nobody even looked surprised. Robb was in the Godswood the next morning, far before anyone had awoken. He was in the middle of praying when the quiet, padding snuffles reached his ears. He turned around to see Sansa picking her way through the leaves, with Lady and Grey Wind beside her. She sat on a flat stone next to him. She didn't say anything, though, and Robb turned back to the tree and continued his praying. When he was done, he turned to her and gripped her hands tightly. "I was afraid," he confessed hoarsely. There were no words for his guilt, for the way he'd felt when he read that first letter from Sansa that told him to come to King's Landing, a terrible mixture of anger, of guilt, of fear. Then whispers had come from the south that they'd escaped, and the rumors that came after had nearly made him weep. But she was here, now. The Starks were home, and they were behind Winterfell's walls, and they were safe. And if there were no words for his feeling when she left, there were even fewer for how he'd felt to see a flame-haired queen ride into Winterfell on a white direwolf. "I know," Sansa replied, her pale hand covering his own. "I was too. There were nights when I was sure they'd catch us and drag us back to King's Landing." They sank back, retreating into quiet contemplation until Robb asked, "You couldn't sleep? Tonight, I mean?" She hesitated, and then seemed to collapse on herself, all thin bones and skinny, coltish elegance. "I wanted to see Lady. And then I couldn't sleep, and I didn't want to disturb Jon. He slept for a full night for the first time in months, so I decided to come to the Godswood." Robb breathed in, breathed out, and looked away. "I'm sorry I wasn't there in King's Landing." Sansa's breath hitched, and then her hand came under his chin and lifted it roughly, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I'm not," she said sharply. "I'm not sorry at all. They tried to kill Father. They did kill Jory. And I need to talk to you about that, so remind me later. But the point is that the only reason Jon survived was because I sent him away, and they didn't expect me to be anything. It was the only way it'd work. I knew that. I just didn't think, maybe if I'd done something I could have saved Jory. I could have saved Septa Mordain. But I didn't. I couldn't. And if you'd been there and you died, I wouldn't have been able to bear it. So you'll be glad you stayed, Robb, or you'll stab me with your needles?" "I'll take Arya's," she snapped, and the rush of relief that came with having someone who treated him like he was an idiot almost bowled him over. "We have to tell the others," Robb told her, leaning back against the stone, closing his eyes and basking in the sun. "Arya's thinking, and we all know how dangerous that is. And Mother isn't stupid either." She snorted, undignified. "I told Father on the way here. He didn't take it well at first. And then he believed me, I think." Sansa paused, sounding testy. "We were all quite tired, you know, and nobody's in the best of moods to be having long conversations while on the run." He didn't open his eyes or turn to meet hers. "But now you have to tell both Mother and everyone else. So how do we do it?" "I don't know. Does it matter?" The words themselves weren't alarming, her tone was. It started sharply and ended on a thin, bitten-off sob. The ruthless way she controlled her body so it was still only worried him further. When he looked up at her, she had a hand pressed to her mouth as if to keep her secrets inside, and there was such pain and slow-building horror that Robb's chest ached as if she'd struck him with a sword. "Sansa," he whispered. She said so softly he could scarcely hear her. I thought..." But she didn't finish. Only buried her head in her pale hands, her red hair spilling out like blood, and began to shake like a sapling in a sea storm. "They beat me," she'd said once. "They took Father's head to hear my screams." "How afraid were you, Sansa?" Back in a city of liars and thieves, with no shield between you and the Lannisters but their contempt. Oh, sweet, darling sister, how afraid were you? How brave were you? Come here, he told her, and then he was holding her, feeling tears soak his collar. That was how they spent the morning, through the cold wind and steadily brightening sky, Robb keeping her grounded in the world and as warm as he could manage. Sansa, though she stopped trying, shook and trembled like a leaf. After some time, she whispered, I thought I'd be normal. Now that I'm back. But it's only. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. I just want it over. And you will, Robb swore. I'll march south and every last person who dared to frighten you will beg for mercy, Sansa. I'll tear their necks open if they don't. She pressed her wrist to her eyes, rubbing away the tears. Robb waited for her to finish. Slowly, she looked back at him. If I sleep, she said, voice small like he'd never heard before, I see Father's head. And I can't. I'll wake up screaming if I do. Then you wake up screaming, Robb replied. And I'll be there. Jon'll be there. Mother, Arya, Bran, Father, someone will be there and will hold you and will remind you that you are a Stark of Winterfell inside Winterfell, and while you've seen horrors and you've survived them, you're not there anymore. The look in Sansa's eyes couldn't be captured in words. Something of hope, and another part of love, and another of relief, but mostly, under it all, a steely, quiet sort of strength that was unique to Sansa. Yes, please, she said and closed her eyes as if too tired to keep them open any longer. Thank you, Robb. My thoughts as a reader. This passage carries both the breathless urgency of an escape and the quiet, aching weight of a family torn apart. Sansa shines here, not in triumph, but in the fragile strength of a girl forced to wear masks of silk while her heart pounds with fear. Ned is drawn with the weary dignity of a father who sees too much of the world's cruelty and too much of his children's courage. The details linger, the whisper of cloaks, the glint of blood, the cold stone corridors, the faint scent of lavender, all painting a world where love and terror walk hand in hand. What lingers after reading is not certainty. What do you think? Will they make it?